Hello, hello. Welcome to episode 43 of the Golden Question podcast. In today's podcast, we're going to be attempting to answer and ask the question, what should taxes be? So I was watching an interview or a sort of a debate. Not an interview, a debate between this guy by the name of Destiny. I don't know his real name, but he I guess he goes by the name Destiny, and he was debating the CPA on a wide variety of topics, but a big bulk of it was taxes. You know, what are the plans? And this was, I believe, before the election, so they were comparing Trump's plan and Kamala Harris's plan. Or Kamala. I don't even really know the correct way to say it, but I think it's Kamala. And what was interesting, I think, first thing I noticed is from the beginning, the CPA, of course, not of course, but the CPA was, in this particular case, leaning on the conservative side and arguing for less taxes. And Destiny not arguing for higher taxes, but arguing for taxes that are more adequate for government expenditures. Now, the way that debate sort of shifted was they started to talk about that taxes were too high and they're a drag on the economy. The CPA specifically used that term, a drag on the economy, and instead of the money being reinvested by company, and he was focusing more on companies per se, and that instead of the companies being able to reinvest the profits, now they're wasting them on paying their taxes. And instead of paying their taxes, they could take that money and invest in inventory, invest in research and development, that all better society, as opposed to sending it to Washington and having it squander and being less efficient with those resources or with that money. But sort of what interestingly happens at the end is he then goes, yeah, you know what? Yeah, to right now, taxes should be able to be inadequate. So he sort of started agreeing with Destiny at the end, saying, yeah, if we have almost $30 trillion in debt right now, we should be able to have taxes that help fund government expenditures. And taxes should be seen as a form of government revenue, and the government, just like a business, just like an individual, can't be spending more than it makes. So I decided to preface that this podcast with that debate because for me, ultimately, believe it or not, the Democrats at least have a more logically sound position with taxes because they know, and this is sort of indirectly, I don't think this is intentional, but both parties, believe it or not, want a lot of government expenditures. And what we're seeing now with the Republicans is, again, I am only 25 years old, so I don't have sort of this huge years of experience with the Republican Party and what their positions were over time. But from what I've seen, the Republican Party have recently actually shifted into more left-leaning ideas, such as promising to not get rid of Social Security and Medicare, promising to keep some federal government agencies intact, like the EPA and the FDA, the USDA. So before, I think earlier on in history, the Republicans were primarily, their concern was keeping a strong military, having a lot of government expenditure on that. And now it's shifted into accommodating more and more things. So earlier on, I think in the history of the politics between Democrats and Republicans, they both wanted big government. It's just one wanted expenditures being spent on welfare and the other on military. And that was seen as the divide between the two. So it's not like one was more or less in favor of lower government expenditures, although one could argue, of course, that the government and military expenditures are not as high as the healthcare, the welfare side of things, which, of course, the two primary ones are Social Security and Medicare. But something that is interesting over time is that now we've seen Republicans, many of them coming out, including Donald Trump himself, saying, look, we're not going to touch Social Security and Medicare. We're going to and then we're also going to make sure that everyone has amazing healthcare, even if it means government subsidies and what have you. So that just makes it even worse. I mean, the earlier position was bad to begin with, but this makes it even worse. So you have the Republicans that want big government, Democrats that want big government. And now the difference is really they're the level of tax. The Republicans want lower taxes. The Democrats want higher taxes. And ultimately, the higher taxes is the better way to fund government at the current expenditures. And this is where this kind of debate toward the end, the CPA started agreeing. I don't know if it was willingly or not, but yeah, if we have a lot of government expenditures, you need to pay for that government somehow. You cannot let the government go into debt and have it be subsidized by the Fed, because the Fed will come in and buy those bonds and create inflation. So ultimately, again, we get into more nuanced debates of the Fed and their money creating policies and the way they create inflation. More in depth into other podcasts, and I might even make sort of new episodes where we go into it even further with some of your suggestions. But ultimately, the best way to fund government is through taxes, because that does one of two things. A, you're paying for government now. You're not deferring the payment of these expenditures into the future. And of course, that's better, because if you defer the payments into the future, you pay interest on it. But not only that, is if the Fed comes in and monetizes the debt, you're also incurring inflation. So that's one reason why you want to pay for it through taxes, because you're paying for it now rather than later with interest and inflation implications. But the second reason is that people get to see the burden of this big government now. And I agree that the larger the government, the more resources are wasted, because the government is not as efficient with the resources than a normal business would be, right? Than the private sector. So, and I hate to use the word the private sector, I just view it as the normal economy, because governments and states, it's not a normal economy, right? Where in an economy, everything's voluntary. The government, as the saying goes, puts a gun to your head. You got to pay your taxes whether you like it or not. So it's not really an economy. An economy is a system where it's only purely voluntary transactions. So you have the real economy, and then you have sort of the government. So I hate to use the word the private sector, but I think if I use that word, people know what I'm talking about. So that's the second reason why taxes are the best way to fund government, because you get to see, the struggles and the burden of government right now, rather than deferring it into the future, thinking that, look, these aren't that bad. We have all these government programs, and look, taxes are low. Well, 5, 6, 10, 15 years down the line, when all of a sudden the inflation catches up to you, because of course there is a drag, right? When the Fed buys up these bonds from these banks, it's not like money just gets deposited into people's accounts. It takes a little bit of time, because all the Fed is doing is giving the banks more credit, or in essence more collateral to issue loans, and then those loans find their way trickling down as businesses are able to take out loans. Ultimately, it all boils down to more and more debt, and then that leads to higher prices, and the first thing that gets really hit with the higher prices are real estate, which a lot of people mortgage and finance, cars, and then that boils down as more people have more money in their homes. When they sell their homes, they take in more money, and then they can buy more things. So it finds its way to trickle down from higher priced assets to lower priced assets. But because of that drag, 5-10 years down the line, then you start seeing the effects of that inflation. And by then, the government programs have already been in place. People are not dependent on them. And then you're stuck in this never-ending cycle. So again, ultimately, the best way to fund government is through taxes. I think I've made that point clear. So let's move on. So another point in the debate is they talk about how and they get into this disagreement. I wish the moderator fact checked them, or they sort of settled this once and for all. But the CPA was under the impression that Biden, ran into larger deficits than Trump did, which I'm looking at it now and it's not true. Over the 4 years for President Trump, he increased the national debt by $7.8 trillion. And that's a 40% increase from the start of his term. And Biden increased it 7 trillion over his 4 years. Again, we're not even done with these last 2 months. So it's 7 trillion. So that's still less than Trump. And that's only a 24.75% increase from the start of his term. So not only did Trump exceed Biden, and again, we're looking at these figures post-inflation, so you would think that these numbers, Biden's numbers should be larger, just purely from the inflation point of view. But yeah, Trump beat Biden, and Trump also beat Obama over his last 4 years. So yeah, I wish they settled that in the debate. He was under the impression that Biden exceeded Trump. That's clearly not true. And it makes sense. Of course, Trump lowered taxes, but he didn't cut government spending. So by definition, the deficit is going to increase. And so that I wanted to address that point real quick. So yeah, this is the problem, is that it's much easier. And again, this is politics as well. It's much easier to lower taxes than it is to lower government expenditures. And right now, what we need to keep taxes the same. Matter of fact, increase them and lower government expenditures just to pay off, just so we can start having some positive surpluses in terms of the budget, and then use that surplus to pay off the debt. So we need to sort of go ahead of the curve now. We don't even need to balance the budget anymore. That's outside of the question. Again, 30 years ago, they were talking about balancing the budget when we didn't have that much debt. But now that the debt is, soon the debt will be yearly what we have accumulated thus far up until the creation of the country. That will be just the annual deficit increase. That's how that's how accelerated the debt has become. So then they started talking about again. I want to get back to the issue of the tax. Now, I personally think that we should not have an income tax, primarily for two reasons. Now, I do think we should have a corporate income tax, believe it or not. So this is where I think I differ from a lot of conservatives, because I think, and that largely has to do with the second reason of why I don't think we should have, or the first. I guess I'm gonna put it first. The first reason why, as I'll explain now, why we shouldn't have a individual income tax. I think that's the word I should coin it. That's the term I should use. An individual income tax. So let's talk about that real quick. So, and I did touch upon this before, and largely it's from Peter Schiff's position. I don't know if this is something he came up with himself or his father did. Presumably he got it from somewhere. So I'll definitely look and see where I can find the source of this and look into it more. But if you look at the history of the United States and the taxes that it used, it mainly taxed, of course, items, and they were non-direct taxes, which, of course, didn't need to be apportioned. And that made sense because you can assess the value of that item and you take a cut of it. Very simple. The math is very easy. Of course, you just have the issue with the valuation, but besides that, it's very clear cut. If an apple costs $5, we want to impose a tariff on it, impose a sales tax on it. You impose it on that item. And you can avoid the tax. This is sort of a minor benefit, is that there's a way to avoid the tax. So you can avoid the tax by simply not buying that item. But that's sort of an irrelevant point. The problem with the individual income tax is that it's such an arbitrary concept of, especially for individuals, not especially, but only for individuals. And this is why I think a corporate income tax makes sense, because a corporation makes, has sales that are quantifiable. It makes sales. We have U.S. GAAP, which attempts to, it has a general concept of what's included in that corporate revenue figure. And then you have a list of deductions, a list of expenditures, and then whatever's left over, that's the corporation's income. That, in my opinion, is somewhat easy to tax. And it's what some of the Supreme Courts, and if you look at the 16th Amendment is what sort of gave Congress the key for the ability to tax it, because the Congress did try to implement it prior, and it was struck down. But if we look at the 1913 case, Independence Limited v. Halbert, this case pretty much was the case that looked at the company's profits. And in this case, it was very easy. The Supreme Court defined, the income tax in this regard as a company, as a tax on the corporate profits. But where it gets very iffy is, how do you define income for an individual? It's such an arbitrary concept. You have individuals kind of have income and expenditures, but not in the way that a corporation does. A person makes a salary. That's why many countries and even some states, looking at like Pennsylvania, for example, they don't really have a income tax. They have like a wage tax. They have a business net income tax, but they have a wage tax. So you're taxing just what the person gets, which is sort of like a gross income tax or gross receipts tax for an individual. But when it comes to an income, it's kind of deceiving, because you think, okay, many Americans are struggling. Many of them are living paycheck to paycheck and then go, living the rest off credit card debt, but yet they still have to pay income tax on their wages, which is gross. So why does a corporation have the ability to take the deductions against its income and only pay tax on the net income, while an individual can't take deductions from his wages? Because he still lives in a house. If he didn't live in a house, he may not be able to get that income. There are many things that make our lives happier and better. Buying a bed, buying a computer, this thing makes our life better, which in return gives us the ability to generate that income. So these are all expenditures. Anything that we do in our lives, going on vacation, makes our life better. And everything we expend is for a reason. And you could make a link to the generation of that income. Because without, if I didn't go on vacation, if I didn't sleep on a nice mattress, if I don't have a roof over my head, do you think I could still be making that income? No. So you could somehow link everything to that income. And the fact that many Americans don't have anything saved up, are going into debt, shows you that they're not generating any net income. And maybe this is just the way that things have boiled down to. But I think in the United States, we really don't have like an individual income tax. It's more of like this wage tax. You get taxed on your wages. You get taxed on anything that comes in. It's not income is more seen as a net of your sales, your receipts, net of certain deductions. So this is, and this is why the courts, and this is why the code is as complex as it is, because Congress never defined what income is. Congress only says, again, unclearly, that gross income is income from whatever source is derived. So you can't use the word, of course, in the definition of the word. That doesn't make any sense. So Congress doesn't define what income is. And the courts, really, the only true definition of income they gave was for corporate profits. But as far as from an individual point of view, it's very wishy-washy. So this is why I think we shouldn't have an income tax. I think we can have and so that's the one reason why we shouldn't have an individual income tax, because of how arbitrary the concept is, and it's not really easily defined, and it requires tremendous complexion in the code, complexities in the code to even attempt to define it. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, and I'll get back to why we shouldn't have an income tax and what the alternative should be, but why we shouldn't have an income tax, that's one reason. The second reason is it, and I'll tie it to actually the second reason. The second reason why is it deters investment and savings, because when you look at when the government taxes your income, they're taxing whatever's left over. And usually, what do people do with that leftover money? They could either spend it on themselves or use the money to reinvest or invest in things, which is them not using it for themselves, which is actually them giving the money to other people to make things better. And hopefully the reward for that are profits that they can, that they're essentially deferring into the future. So with a reward. So that's the main problem with the income tax, is that it defers investment. It defers being able to sacrifice, and instead of using the money for yourself, you make your capital available to other people in the form of capital investment, right? Venture capital. So that's the second reason. I want to keep this a little brief. I know I don't like making these podcasts too long, and again, I want to make more podcasts expanding on this more. But essentially, the income tax discourages investment. Now, yes, you can make an argument that this also should extend to the corporate income tax, because it also discourages investment. And I do think I may need to look into that further, and maybe there's more nuances there. But the idea is we want these taxes to pay to, of course, balance the budget, but not only that, create a surplus so that we can pay down the debt. So yes, I agree, in an ideal world, if we don't need a corporate income tax, then obviously we shouldn't have one. But if we're trying to just figure out how we can pay down this debt, I'm trying to offer, the most efficient way to pay down the debt. What's the most efficient, most bang for your buck tax that you can impose, and how that tax should be structured. So I'll definitely make another podcast on more in depth on how we can balance the budget. But I think right now I want to focus on the income tax per se. But so that was the second reason, that it discourages investment. Now, what should we do as an alternative for the individual income tax? In my opinion, a consumption tax. Because a consumption tax will, of course, tax people who want to use the money for themselves and not invest it, not offer it up for society. And this should be the way, an economy works. Economy, of course, the only way for an economy to grow is through savings and investment, not consumption. Consumption actually destroys society in the interim, because you're consuming the goods that are produced, right? How do you determine if an economy is successful? The amount of output it has, the amount of goods it has. And if you consume all the goods, you're utilizing the goods. Now, of course, people need to utilize the goods because we need to live, but we also need a surplus so that we can reinvest and have those goods available in the future where they might not be available. So ultimately, I think a consumption tax is great because it encourages investment by discouraging current consumption. Now, of course, this comes with hardships, because a lot of people, they would rather consume the money now than invest it. But this is what we need to grow the economy. So I think I want to end the episode now. I don't want to go too long, but I'll definitely make another episode expanding more on how we can specifically pay down the debt and what taxes we should impose, what sort of their ideal rate should be. And I definitely want, and just I guess a sneak peek is I'm going to get into the estate tax, and more in conjunction, of course, with the gift and GST tax, but primarily the estate tax, and we'll look into Social Security and Medicare. So hope you guys enjoyed, and thanks for listening.